And welcome to OCR History B, Living Under Nazi Rule. This is the final content video for Theme 5, which is occupation. With an example of occupation in the East, and we're going to have a look at Poland. So the Nazis occupied Poland in September 1939. The Nazis invaded Poland for Lebensraum, or living space, which was an idea that Hitler outlined in Mein Kampf in the 1920s. Poland is seen as an area of inferior people. It's an area that Hitler wants under his control, and he anticipates being able to control it quite quickly. If you have a look at the European maps that you can see on the slide in front of you, you can see Nazi Germany, and you can see that they have already, prior to the invasion of Poland, occupied part of Czechoslovakia. We can see Poland then in this section here that's outlined in gold, and this is the section where Germany then occupy. So by October 1939, Poland no longer exists. It has been split into 5 regions, with 4 being in Germany. The 5th region, or the largest, is called the General Government, and it's ruled by Hans Frank. So how did the Nazis destroy Polish culture? So first of all, they removed culture. By May 1940, culture, education and leadership has been completely destroyed, and around 30,000 of the most talented Polish leaders have been arrested. We then see the removal of Slavic Poles, so these people are considered racially inferior, and 1.9 million non-Jewish citizens were murdered by the SS and the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht is another word for the army. So 1.9 million Slavic Poles, these are not Jews, have been murdered as a result of being seen as Untermensch or inferior. There's the removal of other Poles as well. So between 1939 and 1945, we see 1.5 million Polish people sent to Germany for forced labour. Remember, they are being used in concentration camps. And there was a law for Polish decrees which gave rules which said that there would be less pay, humiliation, and that workers had to wear a P armband. So these decrees were extremely humiliating and discriminatory towards the Polish people, again reinforcing that they were seen as Untermensch. We then see the removal of Jewish Poles. So 3.5 million Jewish Polish people were ghettoised. They were put into ghettos which were walled in concentrated areas with terrible conditions, and 3 million Jewish Poles were murdered in the death camps such as Auschwitz. In terms of resistance to Nazi occupation, we see the Polish government escape to London in 1939, so they get out of the country as soon as the Nazis have invaded, and they established the Delegatura, which is a secret state in Poland, to try and keep up some resistance to the Nazis. In August 1944, we also see the Warsaw Uprising. So Warsaw is the largest ghetto in Poland, and we saw a fight back from people for 2 months. This ghetto saw the deaths of over 500,000 people, Jews, within this ghetto because the conditions were so bad. So we're unsurprised that there was an uprising, but the people within the ghetto managed to arm themselves and to fight back for 2 months when they were on starvation rations, extremely weak and not trained at fighting. Was very, very impressive in terms of resistance. Despite this, though, the Nazis brutally crushed this uprising, and 200,000 people are killed as a result. So in comparison now, we're going to have a look at the occupation of the Netherlands, which is in the west. So this is a completely different occupation due to the fact that the people in the Netherlands are seen as Übermensch, so superior people, rather than Untermensch, inferior people, which we saw the Nazis use that terminology for the people in Poland, remember. So this is going to be different. So in May 1940, we see the Nazis invade the Netherlands. Remember, the Netherlands is also known as Holland, and the people there are Dutch. Okay, so you can see on screen, this area here is the area that we are talking about when we're talking about the invasion of the Netherlands. So as a result of them being seen as Übermensch, they are treated more equally, and their treatment is more favourable. Civil servants kept their jobs, such as teachers, etc., although 30% of mayors did choose to step down, so they didn't want to be kind of in courts that were following Nazi rules. Education remained untouched, so people were allowed to continue with their education, and there was actually a Dutch brigade of SS soldiers, which really does reinforce that they were seen as Übermensch, because remember, the SS were these extreme elite fighters for Adolf Hitler, so the Dutch are allowed their own branch of this group. And in June 1940, we see people wear white carnations to support the exiled Dutch royal family. So this is the first kind of indication that perhaps people aren't happy, obviously, with Nazi rule, despite the fact that they are being treated more favourably. And as a result of this, we see some Dutch resistance, and this does lead to change in the way that the Nazis are treating the people in the Netherlands, despite the fact that they are seen as Übermensch. So in February 1941, we see 425 Jewish men rounded up for deportation. And this leads to people questioning the Nazi rule. We then see Dutch communists calling for a strike. Now remember, in Germany, the trade unions have been banned in 1933, so the fact that a left-wing group in the Netherlands are now kind of leading the way for workers to call a strike is really going to anger Adolf Hitler. Trams are halted and strikers march down the streets of Dutch towns. This is really going to infuriate the leadership of the Nazi Party. The German army, unsurprisingly, as a result of this, are extremely angered, as I've said, and they shoot at the strikers. So 9 are killed and hundreds are arrested, really reinforcing now that the Nazis can be quite brutal and harsh in the Netherlands, despite the fact that they are Übermensch. And on the 13th of March 1941, we have the first death sentence against a Dutch person issued. So we can clearly see that there is a movement by 1941, after the invasion of 1940, for the behaviour of the Nazis to become harsher if people were not following their rule. 3 strikers and 15 members of the Dutch resistance were also shot. So they're switched then to intimidation and violence. So in April 1942, all Dutch Jews have to wear a Star of David to single them out and identify them. By 1943, the Nazis begin to deport the Jews to extermination camps. So 107,000, which is 76% of the Jewish population in the Netherlands, are deported to camps. Dutch men are used as forced labour to replace German soldiers called up. By 1944, men aged 16 to 60 had to report for labour, and 1/3, which was 500,000 of all eligible men went. So we can clearly see here they're being used in the same way really as Polish men were being used to replace German soldiers. Their treatment wouldn't have been as bad, but nonetheless they are used as forced labour. Dutch resistance grew, so they hid 300,000 men and they published leaflets, so we can clearly see again an outcry as a result of German occupation. 20,000 resistance members were arrested and they were sent to 4 Dutch camps that had been established. And living conditions continued to worsen for the people in the Netherlands. The winter of 1944, so a year before the war ends, saw 20,000 Dutch people starve to death. And in May 1945, we see the Netherlands is liberated. So this is when they retain or get back their freedom and they are no longer under Nazi control. So you can clearly see here that although it starts off quite positively for the Netherlands, it does soon turn into the violence and brutality that we would expect from Nazi occupation. Nonetheless, there is a direct comparison that you need to make in the exam if you want to speak about occupation between Poland and the East and the people who are seen as Untermensch or inferior, and the occupation of the Netherlands in the West and the people who are seen as Übermensch and superior. The Holocaust and the timeline really that leads us to this infamous event. So the Holocaust and genocide is one of the worst crimes in human history. 11 million people, including Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, communists and homosexuals, were murdered by the Nazis by 1945, and nearly 6 million of that figure were Jews who were systematically killed using Zyklon B gas in the gas chambers at camps such as Auschwitz. As the Nazis controlled more of the East, they controlled more Jewish people, and they saw this as a Jewish problem that needed a solution. Remember, we've spoken in earlier videos about the fact that the Jewish population only actually made up 1% of Germany and about 500,000 people. However, as the Nazis continued to expand east, the countries that they occupied, they had a higher level of Jewish population, and this means that the Nazis need to come up with a solution. Which ends up being what we know today as the final solution, or the Holocaust. So the Holocaust does not happen overnight. It is a result of a decade's worth of anti-Semitic and racial policy. So let's have a look at some of these policies. So first of all, between 1939 and 1941, we see the concentration in ghettos. Remember, these walled-in areas that Jews are only allowed in and out of if they are seen as essential workers that can contribute to the war effort. The vast majority of people are locked within the ghettos. The conditions are atrocious. Disease spreads very easily, and starvation is extremely common. So there were 3.5 million Jews in Poland, so immigration was not an option. They concentrated Jews into ghettos, which, as I said, were enclosed areas in towns. There were hundreds of these ghettos in Poland, and the largest was Warsaw. So by 1941, they had 445,000 people. That's 1/3 of the Warsaw population living in just 2.4% of its area, so extremely cramped conditions. Overcrowding and disease was rife, and 140,000 Jews in these ghettos died in 3 years. We then have the Einsatzgruppen. So the Einsatzgruppen are the killing squads, and these groups begin from June 1941. And this is where mass murder begins with the invasion of the Soviet Union, where again there is a high Jewish population. So it is a mobile killing unit of SS and police, and they follow the Wehrmacht, which remember is the German army, as they invaded. Their job was to round up Jews and communists and to shoot them in the woodland. So it is using bullets and it is using guns. And in the winter of 1941, 90% of the victims were Jewish, and that equates to 1 million people. Now, the Einsatzgruppen is a huge step towards mass extermination. Obviously, at this point, they are not using gas, they are using guns. And it quickly becomes clear that there is a psychological impact on the SS officers that are shooting the Jews, so there needs to be a different solution that is found. And also bullets were needed in the war, and the fact that shooting people just isn't quick enough. So as brutal as that sounds, this is why we do not see the Einsatzgruppen continue throughout the remainder of the war, and the Nazis come up with a different solution. We then start to see murder by gas for the first time in Poland in autumn 1941. So there is a decision made to murder en masse the Jews that are in Poland, and that is called Operation Reinhard. So it begins with gas vans at Chelmo, and 3 death camps were created in 1942 at Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. The camps are completely secret. They are run by the SS. Jews are deported, stripped of items and then gassed. And by 1945, 1.7 million Polish Jews have been murdered. So we can see here the kind of gradual move towards the Holocaust from the ghettos to the Einsatzgruppen to now using gas. And this is where, after this has been trialled really in Poland, we see what is known as the final solution signed at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. So during the Wannsee Conference, it is decided that there will be removal of all Jews from Europe. All of them will be removed and transported to the general government for execution. Adolf Eichmann, who is a senior SS man, is in charge of this process. And we have camps then such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is located in Poland. So Jews from across Europe were transported in horrendous conditions. SS guards and doctors began selection. So those who were fit and able to work went to Auschwitz, and those who were seen as unfit, 75% of people who arrived were sent straight to one of 4 gas chambers, which was in Birkenau. So Auschwitz continued to work as partly as a labour camp, and Birkenau is the extermination section of the camp. Remember, we know that the Jews, when they entered the gas chambers, were made to feel like they were going to have a shower. Zyklon B pellets were then dropped. Zyklon B is a pesticide, which is a deliberate decision again by the Nazis, and the Jews that were in those chambers would have been killed within 20 minutes. We had Sonderkommandos, who were groups of Jewish prisoners who were forced to work for the Nazis, who would be asked to remove bodies from the chambers and burn them in the crematorium. Now you might ask why they did this. It simply kept them alive for longer. So they would be given slightly better food, and obviously the hope was perhaps for those individuals that if they were removing the bodies, they wouldn't be gassed themselves. However, the vast majority of the Sonderkommandos ended up dead too, and they would have been killed after a few months of working. So the Nazis themselves didn't get their hands that dirty in terms of the gas chambers, they actually get Jewish guards, Sonderkommandos, to do that for them. So up to 12,000 Jews died per day, and we end up at just Auschwitz alone with a total of over 1 million people who were exterminated through the use of gas in the gas chambers. So that is what you need to know about the Holocaust, the timeline that leads up to this, and it might be that you should consider which was the most significant turning point towards the Holocaust. So have a look at these different events on the timeline, have a look at the statistics, and try and remember what you can about this horrendous crime for human history. So the final part of the fifth theme, which is occupation, is responses to Nazi rule. So there were 3 responses to living under Nazi occupation, and they were resisting, collaborating and accommodating. So the idea of resistance, which is working against the Nazis in the form of small to large acts of terrorism, we have a few examples of. So we've got a significant number of Poles who helped 450,000 Jews escape certain death. And then we have the Belsky partisans, who numbered 1,236 escapees from Polish ghettos. The film Defiance is based on the story of the Belsky partisans, and I'd really encourage you to go away and watch that as an example of resistance. Collaboration means working for or with the Nazis and actively helping with their occupation. And the examples that we have are in Belgium. We have the Die Vlag movement, which had 50,000 members in 1943, and it helped to recruit SS soldiers. And the Chetniks, who were a group of Serbian nationalists who also helped the Nazis. So a couple of examples there that you could utilise for collaboration. In terms of accommodating the Nazis, this means tolerating or putting up with them, not actively helping them, but accepting the fact that they are there. And the examples are the Danish people, who were allowed to keep their government in return for establishing good relations with the Germans, and the Greek Prime Minister, who had been chosen by the Nazis. So there is a particular example that you could speak about in terms of responses, which is the Nazi occupation of France. So Germany invaded France in May 1940. And the northern zone was directly occupied and ruled by the Nazis with strict rules. So you can see the yellow section that's just appeared on the slide is the northern zone. So this is directly occupied. The southern zone, though, was known as Vichy France, and this was controlled by an 84-year-old right-wing politician, French nationalist Philippe Pétain, and the area remained unoccupied, but it was a collaborator of Nazi Germany. So as much as the Nazis don't occupy the area, they know that it is in their opinion, very safe hands. Both zones suffered, so hundreds of thousands of French men were sent as forced labour to Germany, and over 70,000 French Jews were deported. French resistance formed, and they fought against the Nazis by providing intelligence to the Allies or sabotaging Nazi rule, and there were other examples of passive resistance as well. So the French did not just bow down to the Nazis, but it's a very unusual case because of the way that the country was split. In terms of case studies for resistance and collaboration, we have André Trocmé, who was a Protestant pastor in the southeast of France, so he was in Vichy France. Between December 1940 and September 1944, he arranged for 5,000 Jews, mostly children, to be hidden, so took a huge risk. The local population hid them in homes and schools and farms. They forged IDs for them, gave them rations, and even led escapes to Switzerland. In February 1943, he was arrested. He was released, but he had to go into hiding, so an extremely brave example of resistance. On the other hand, we have Coco Chanel, who was a Nazi collaborator. So she was established as a famous designer and perfume maker in the 1930s. She stayed in Paris and became friends with the Nazis. She began a romance with a military intelligence officer who was German, and she may have been a Nazi spy. In 1941, she took advantage of anti-Semitic legislation to remove Jewish directors of her perfume company. This was not successful, but it showed her anti-Semitic tendencies and her pro-Nazi stance. So that is the final part of occupation and the responses to Nazi rule. So please revise this carefully, and that concludes our videos on living under Nazi rule content.